All right, welcome everyone. Whether you're joining us live or if you're watching this afterwards, um, this is, I believe, our first talk in our Innovation Fund series, and it's going to be given by Natalie. So I'll quickly introduce Natalie. She actually went to Harvard. She studied math, applied math and economics here, and she was also on the varsity women's volleyball team. So she can give more of a description of like what she's done over the years, but some quick bullet points. She worked at Zenefits for a while as one of the first product managers there, and she grew it from only 10 employees to eventually over 1,000 employees, and grew the revenue stream from $1 million to $60 million in revenue. She is also now working in venture capital. She works at Spark, and she focuses on early stage enterprise software companies that are reinventing the way that people work. So that's a very brief description of her. I'll let Natalie do most of the talking from here, and she's going to be touching upon growth plans and how to grow your business.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Walden. So yeah, as Walden mentioned, currently an early stage venture at Spark Capital, and we'll give kind of a brief overview of the Spark and then kind of dig into some of the things I think about with respect to growth. Spark, we're actually a Boston-based firm, so DNA is in Boston, but have offices in San Francisco and New York. You can think of us as we could be your first check-in to a company. We could also support you all the way through to IPO. I sit on our early stage team, so primarily investing in things like pre-seed to Series A companies. So maybe these companies have an early product, maybe it's just an idea, but they're really thinking about how do you get the product in the hands of users? How do you think about starting to scale up growth? And my background is more on the operating side and building out companies and building out products. So as Walden mentioned, probably most notably at Zenefits, saw the kind of hyper growth scale of the company there. And then also have worked at earlier stage companies, think like 3-person companies and 15 to 40-person companies. Yeah, so that's a little bit on my background. What I can dig into is, I know you guys are probably all at like different stages of the company journey, but also different, almost think about it as business models that you're going after. So I can talk a little bit about kind of the scaling journey at Zenefits, if that's interesting to people. Can also talk about some of the companies that I work with and just kind of almost like growth hacking tactics we've had there.
Yeah, I think starting with your stuff at Zenefits would be a great place.
And we want this to be engaging. So like if you guys have questions as things come up or want to chime in, like feel free to. So when I joined Zenefits, we were about 40 employees. We had an early product in market. We were a little less than $1 million in revenue. For those of you who aren't familiar with Zenefits, think of it as an all-in-one HR and benefits platform. So now you have a lot of players in the space. You have companies like JustWork or Namely or Rippling. But we were kind of a premier company in the space that was started about 6 years ago. And I'd say like our key hack in terms of the industry was actually the business model innovation. So if you looked at the landscape at the time, you had the biggest change that was coming onto the market with the ACA, and thinking about the ACA as a regulation is actually it's gonna force a lot of these small businesses to need to be able to adopt benefits. And so what we said at Zenefits is, hey, you actually have all these insurance brokers within the ecosystem. They're getting paid a commission of the insurance broker, the insurance premiums, but they're not actually providing a lot of value to their customers. So how can you create this delightful technology experience that touches on both things like benefits as well as payroll and HR, and really becomes a unified system of record to then help this kind of underserved segment in the market that was small businesses. And I think a key thing about Zenefits was we were providing a free product and we're finding other creative ways to make revenue. So for example, the commissions that we got off of insurance premiums, that was a core stream of revenue. We also acted as almost like lead gen brokers to other premium products that we were offering within our all-in-one suite. And so that was like one learning from Zenefits was, hey, are there ways that you can actually provide both a faster, better, and for us, it was like definitely a cheaper product that was serving this segment of the market that was super underserved in terms of SMBs and like the long tail businesses in the US. So that was kind of the initial hack, was thinking about, okay, we're providing a better, faster, cheaper product, and a more delightful experience. We're finding a creative way to make revenue. The next challenge was thinking about, how do you actually get it in the hands of all these different companies and all these different SMBs, which are notoriously hard to reach. And I think I'll talk about different strategies we use, but I'll also talk about different learnings, because I think reflecting on the time at Zenefits, there were a lot of things we did really well. There were a lot of things we didn't do so well. And I think the things we didn't do so well actually led us to a point where we grew too quickly and weren't able to continue scaling. But if I think about like the core channels that we use in terms of driving growth in the early days, it was a multi-pronged approach in terms of both marketing and sales. But a few things that actually definitely stuck out is, initially we were hyper-focused on California as a geographic region. And we actually took the approach of doing a lot of like kind of grassroots hacky marketing. And one of the things we were notorious for was actually putting up billboards on the highways, like the 101 highway in San Francisco, where people are always driving back and forth. And we did different campaigns that were attacking our competitors. So think like kind of take Workday down and kill Workday. We also just had simple messaging that was like your all-in-one HR solution, and that seemed to resonate with people. But that actually generated a lot of leads for us that were within the startup community and the small businesses there that were our initial kind of focus. And then from there, I was thinking about, okay, if we can go after California and we've saturated more of the tech community within there, what are the adjacent customer types? So whether it's retail SMBs, mom and pop construction shops, other geographic regions that we want to go after, that we can scale up some of this growth. And so for us, it was a combination of kind of high velocity direct outbound sales, and really using the combination of like SDRs and AEs to close deals quickly. Our sales cycle was pretty tight. It could be as low as a single day. It could be 4 weeks on the longer side, but really high velocity sales. And then thinking about how can we actually partner with other service providers. And I'd say that partnerships are really key within the SMB market, but thinking about people like maybe accountants or tax agents who are already touching these customers that can then give you leverage within that distribution. So one of the things I always talk about with the founders that I work closely with is just for you guys, like, how do you think about getting leverage in your business, especially on the distribution side? And I think one of my key learnings from being on the venture side is the best product doesn't always win. I'd like to think that the best product always wins, but it's really more about how can you hack distribution? How can you figure out a business model and really a go-to-market strategy that works for both your customer and the market in terms of scaling things efficiently? So I'll pause there because I feel like I'm talking at you guys right now, but.
Yeah, so if any of you guys have questions, like I'm sure Natalie will be happy to answer them.
Yeah, I can chime in. I'd be curious to hear if you have any specific growth strategies for more consumer-facing products as opposed to more internal SaaS enterprise type things.
Yeah, and I'll frame it in, so I invest a lot in, think like bottoms up SaaS and productivity tools. And I actually think that has definitely some parallels to kind of a consumer, because you're really going after the individual user. In the early days, and when I say early, I mean, hey, you have inklings of a product, you have a hypothesis, maybe you have kind of the first version of the product and you're trying to get it in the hands of users. I always think that's like the scrappiest phase of the company. And I think it's where it's like you're kind of doing anything to get feedback, and you're firing on like more cylinders than you'd probably think in terms of just trying to get the product in the hands of users. One thing I think about is how can you go where the users already are, whether that's online or offline. So maybe you're building a social app and you're actually trying to target high schoolers. Like, how can you actually, and I have a friend who did this, he built up just a massive network of kind of ambassadors at different high schools and was giving them almost like the branding, and they were creating like viral videos, both on like TikTok and kind of behind the scenes on other channels. But he was basically channeling it through these kind of like core nodes in the network of a high school. But behind the scenes, he was kind of the mastermind, and he's like a 35-year-old man. So it'd be a little bit weird if he showed up to a high school, but just really thinking about how you can get the products in the hands of users. And the other things I think about is, for example, at Spark, we invest in a lot of community-based products. So think Tumblr, Twitter, that type of thing. And some of the early growth stories there were kind of hacking into these online communities that might already be popping up, whether it was on blogs or whether there are communities on Reddit or Facebook, but almost trying to piggyback those channels until you get more users onto the product. We have a company called Homies in our portfolio that's going after immigrant communities across the world. And I know a big source of acquisition for them has been, how can you actually kind of ride the wave of next door communities, which are like local, just online communities that are centered around your neighborhood. And then also going after kind of physical locations where people congregate. I know for example, they targeted in the Bay Area, there was a movie theater that attracted a lot of Indian immigrants. So how could they actually get the branding and kind of partner with those types of communities to hack growth? But in the early days, I think it's a lot of, again, firing on all cylinders, being creative, trying different things out. We typically don't see companies using a lot of paid marketing in the beginning. So doing things like running ads, whether it's on Facebook, TikTok, other communities, but that's partly because they're trying to actually validate the idea and validate whether there's a customer need. Yeah. So happy to dig in further if there are other questions.
Yeah, so you mentioned sort of taking an approach where the end user has the service for free, and then your business model being on the end of like commissions from insurance providers. I'm curious to know, what are the steps to sort of getting that commission program in place? Are you sort of like manually making those deals with insurance, or is it existing rebate programs that you're tapping into?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in the case of Zenefits, and this was definitely like an arbitrage opportunity that Parker, our founder, was like, that was kind of the genesis of the company. But to be an insurance broker, you actually have to be licensed in different states. But it's similar to like becoming a real estate agent or kind of other licensed professions. It's actually pretty easy to become an insurance broker. And it mainly just requires, say, like setting up an entity and then passing different tests within the states that you want to sell insurance to. So that was the process where basically anyone who sold the software at the company had to become a licensed insurance broker. And that enabled us to then get the commission. And when I'm talking about the commission for us per employee life on our platform was about $400 per year. And if you think about that as a recurring revenue in the context of SaaS, that's a great stream of revenue per employee. So it was definitely a hack. One of the places where we actually got in trouble when we were scaling was that licensing requirement, and insurance is highly regulated industry. We had all the old school brokers kind of putting a target on our back. And so they were coming after us, trying to kind of poke holes in our process, figure out where we weren't properly handling situations. So that was like something that actually, it caused some issues later on, but it was an initial hack. Yeah.
Very interesting. Super cool.
Yeah.
In terms of forming those actual relationships with the companies you were brokering and getting that type of model where it's like $400 a year, how did you go about sort of also doing that side of this, what's almost a sales process, I guess?
Yeah. So in terms of, yeah, it was a lot of relationship building, like both in terms of the insurance community and being a known quantity there. And one of the things that we did early on was the DNA of the company was definitely kind of Silicon Valley tech. Parker, our CEO, had already founded 2 companies before. And so he actually brought in early on, call it like first 20 employees, people that came from the insurance industry who had that kind of breadth of connections and could help us parse out the industry. But one thing I'll say is, like, for example, when I joined the company, they basically said, hey, we don't understand like basically COBRA health insurance. So it's like the type of health insurance that you get when you leave a company. We don't understand this piece of the business, just go figure it out. And so in order to figure that out, especially when you're an early stage company and don't have a lot of resources, I was just calling the insurance carriers to ask them questions and almost like creating these rules and creating this like metadata and information that we could then productize into the system. But it was a very like grassroots approach of, one, like figuring out the industry, but also working to build relationships in the industry. And it's funny for me to look back on that, because one of the companies I invested in earlier this year is a company called Noyo. And essentially they're building the connectors between health insurance carriers and benefits platforms like Zenefits. And they're basically brokering those data transactions. And so this was a team that came out of Zenefits and was building the product internally back in the day. But one of the things I think about with that company is that when you're going after an antiquated industry, there is this need for both the tech and being able to build a product and being able to build like a data focused system, but married that with having the relationships in the industry, looking and feeling like the industry, and like, yes, you're rattling the status quo, but you also need to balance kind of playing nicely with the current incumbents.
So is that Zoyo investment? Is that like a plaid for insurance type setup?
Yeah. So as Spark, we led the like seed round and the Series A in plaid. So that's been a big win for the firm. But the whole thesis there is it's similar to plaid for health insurance. And the main thesis is, okay, if you can own that data kind of clearinghouse where there's actually a lot of manual processes, there are a lot of errors that result in people not having health insurance. If you can own that data highway, then you can also think about, okay, what applications can you actually build on top of that? Whether it's billing, whether it's CRM, whether it's kind of partner management, whether it's net new applications on kind of the consumer side. So thinking about that is kind of disrupting the health insurance space.
And so how do they build that sort of connection with a company that may not have like APIs or like existing gateways to fit into? Like, how does that work?
Yeah, so this is the carriers, the health insurance carriers, they're definitely on their journey in terms of like digital transformation, and both like upgrading their infrastructure in terms of kind of like not being a monolith and being more like service oriented in terms of their architecture. Potentially some of them have APIs, but they're actually going into the insurance carrier and pitching, hey, we can help you think about your API strategy. And again, this was what the team was doing at Zenefits, but pitching to the carrier, hey, we can help you think about this, and then we can give you better distribution through these platforms now that you have a unified data model. But it's also at times they're meeting the carrier where they are. So the carrier, in terms of data transfers, they typically rely on a standard file format called EDI, or they rely on paper forms and faxes. So at times they're also meeting the carrier where they are, but ideally they're building in APIs. And so if you think about it, it's a long, complex, multi-party sale. It's a long integration, but once you have that connection, it's hard to take away. But it does build up defensibility over time.
That's great.
One question that I had about growth is, I know you joined Zenefits very, very early on, and I think grew, maybe it was the product team from I don't know how many X, but it was extraordinary growth. I imagine the hiring process is very difficult, even at the
Yeah.
early stage, like sourcing. Let's say like the first engineering employee is already difficult. I can't imagine sourcing dozens or hundreds of employees while maintaining like skill, culture, and I don't even the pipelines themselves, aside from like posting online, even finding the people to interview seems like a huge task in itself. So I'm curious, how did you even find a pipeline of people to hire? And then after you got that pipeline, how did you effectively like maintain this culture and skill set in the face of rapid growth?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So, and like for context, I joined Zenefits when we were about, call it like 40 employees. About half of those were engineers. At like our peak, we were over 1,000 employees and grew to 4 different offices globally. And then we came back down after some layoffs to about 800. So it was this rapid scaling and scaling in different geos, which also presents different challenges. I'll start first with talking about engineering. I think engineering at startups it's like really challenging, and it's challenging for all the companies I work with, and there are different strategies that people take. One of the key things for us at Zenefits is our CTO Lux. He's Indian, and he came out of an Indian university, and so our initial engineers were mainly people that he had worked with before at, I think, D. Shaw. So he was really tapping into his network in terms of kind of bringing people together into the company. But then you reach a point where those kind of immediate networks are tapped out. I think also the kind of the con of tapping into your immediate networks is, like, I'm a woman in tech. I think about gender diversity. I think about racial diversity, right? So you can only go so far with your network at times. And so after that, it became a question of how do you actually attract other top talent to continue to build out the organization, not just in engineering, but across the board. And so a few things that I think about from Zenefits is there are a few really key things that help. Like, outside financing does help companies attract better talent. So for us, Andreessen Horowitz had led our Series A. They also doubled down on us at the Series B. We quickly became kind of the darling of the valley, just in terms of that crazy growth and kind of unicorn status. So I think that stamp of approval from Andreessen definitely helped in terms of hiring. But even so, internally in the company, I mean, there were days where like you wouldn't be able to do work because you were just interviewing people all the time. And we had to really quickly spin up processes in terms of what were we evaluating in candidates, both from a culture perspective, what were kind of the scripts that we used in interviews, and what were the values that we were hiring for, as well as thinking about processes for actually what like their skills and the opportunity that they were filling were. So we were doing a lot of like process iterations just on the recruiting process. And I think one of the things that we did well is we actually hired in-house recruiters early on to help just wrangle all the people that were kind of working on these processes across teams. The other thing that we did a lot of is like we were constantly going through reorgs because we were changing the company and growing out different teams. And I think as an employee, that is hard. Like, it was chaotic. It was really chaotic. But the trade-off was that we were growing so quickly that growth was kind of addicting, and you were always figuring out the next problem. And I think that Parker, as a leader, was very transparent about the kind of growing pains we were going through. And I think one thing I really valued in terms of his leadership style was just being super transparent about both the pros and cons of the company in terms of what was going well and what wasn't going well. But he definitely had to lead the ship in terms of the chaos and the changes of what was going on. And we scaled up to, we were initially in San Francisco, we scaled up to San Francisco, an engineering office in Vancouver, an ops office in Arizona to control some of the costs, as well as an engineering office in India. So then it became a question of like, okay, we have multiple offices. How do you communicate? How do you make sure that HQ isn't the only team that has the information, but really thinking about creating more of like a global organization.
Yeah, sounds like many of the issues companies would face with remote work as well when you have HQs across the world. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah, and like remote work. I mean, when COVID happened, we definitely were all hands on deck with our portfolio, just making sure that companies were set up for success. And I mean, I still think some of our companies are adjusting in terms of they're used to being in the office, they're used to having people together. And it's a different form of communication, especially when you're really early in that product and company building journey, in terms of being intentional about setting culture, being intentional about communication to kind of address, even if you were just scoping out a product, making sure that you get feedback from the rest of the team. And yeah, it's challenging, but people seem to be working through it.
To piggyback off of Brian's question, could you go a little bit more into scaling product teams? Like I imagine that with an early stage venture, product decisions and feature decisions are kind of decided by a handful of people. But what does that look like when you have 1,000 people working on a team? Like how do you divide up the work and how does that look like?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So I'll talk about a couple companies in my experience. So Zenefits, when I joined, we didn't have product managers, even though we were a 40-person company. And part of that decision, like my title was a general manager of kind of the benefits unit. And what that meant is basically do everything, figure out product, but also figure out customer support, operations, kind of what the end-to-end experience looks like. The reason we didn't have product managers is because Parker himself, who's our CEO, was a former product manager. And he always thought that they caused bottlenecks in terms of just velocity of the company. So it wasn't until David Sachs came on board as our COO, where he was like, why don't we have a product team? And I kind of got plucked to that to help kind of jumpstart it. But the other experience that I'll talk about is the last company I worked for. We were a pre-seed stage company. We were about 15 employees. We were building machine learning fraud detection based in London. When I joined the company, it was only the founding team and data scientists and engineers. And the role of the first product manager, in my opinion, is very different than kind of scaling up a product team over time. And I'm a firm believer that at an early stage company, it's the CEO and likely the founding team that really has that vision for the product and is also doing the early sales for a product. And again, I'm thinking more on the B2B side, but even so on the consumer side, is doing the early work in terms of sales and bringing that product to market. And they're naturally getting a really fast cycle of feedback in terms of where the product should go and what they should iterate on. So I think they're kind of different milestones in the company, but the first is like bringing on the first PM. And I think I always tell people, if you're joining as the first PM of the company, you need to be really clear on what that role is, because it might actually look more like a project manager, or it might look like someone who's exploring the go-to-market side of things and being a little bit more customer facing, or it could be kind of true product management in terms of the cycle of ideation and customer facing all the way through to delivering the product. But it can definitely mean different things. In terms of scaling up a product team, one of the things that really stuck out for me from Zenefits is just the amount of domain expertise that people needed in terms of the product we were building. I would say like not everyone knows what insurance is, or not everyone knows kind of like the nuts and bolts of a payroll product. And so one of the strategies that I thought was really great that we did at Zenefits is we had like a multi-pronged strategy of hiring from externally as well as promoting internally. And so what that let us do is basically bring in talent from kind of other companies. Maybe they're a bit more seasoned just in terms of what the core principles and philosophies of product development are, but marry that with kind of people internally, including myself, who are already doing the job and have the domain expertise. But we could work together and like learn from each other in terms of kind of how to drive the product forward. I think the thing that we didn't do well at Zenefits was actually hiring almost like middle level management across the organization, not just in product, to help create more scaffolding and almost lines of communication across teams. And that definitely corresponded to the product team, where we were just kind of a ton of product people negotiating with each other and organizing around what we thought was a strategy, but it might not have been the most clear strategy. But that also was in teams like the op teams and the engineering teams, where it wasn't always clear kind of who should be in the room, who should be driving the decision-making process. And so again, it took us a little bit of time to figure that out, but I think kind of bringing in that mid-level management across the company could have helped us do that. So those are at least some initial thoughts about kind of scaling up a team and a product. And I guess the one final thought is, as the company scales, the role of the product manager naturally becomes, I'd say, more narrow. So in the early days of Zenefits, I was touching on, as we scale the company, I was more focused in on, say, just and making sure that we were doing more depth in terms of that product and fixing all the edge cases, working with new types of customers. So the role definitely shifted over time.
Just a quick follow-up. Is it fair to think of scaling product teams as sort of like a pyramid of multi-layered PM? So like a head PM who oversees all the other PMs and so on. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, that's definitely a fair assessment. And like, for example, at the fraud detection company I was working at, we ended up scaling up to about 50 people while I was there. And I was leading the product team, but then had about 2 or 3 product managers and then 1 to 2 designers working on our team. And for us with that product in particular, there was a lot of like net new kind of greenfield product that we wanted to do like research with our customers on and explore that. But there was also this notion of we were building out more of like almost an infrastructure product in terms of the amount of data we were handling and the APIs that we were building. And so there were a lot of almost like project management type tasks in terms of driving the engineering and the machine learning, like our data scientist team forward. So those were kind of the 2 focus areas. And then it was also that it made sense for design to fall underneath product at the time, but that could also be almost a different team that splits out over time in terms of whether it's design or even like UI copy or product marketing as kind of another sub function within the market or product arm.
Sure.
Yeah.
Hi, so I know you mentioned like the CEO at Zenefits like was like believed that like product managers created like bottlenecks within like the process of like getting things done. So like personally, do you believe that's true, or do you think that it might be true in like certain cases, or like what is your like personal take on that?
Yeah, so I personally don't think that's true, but I think it also depends on the people you hire in this stage of the company. So I think like when I think about early stage companies and hiring, a lot of the times you might be hiring someone based off of potential, and you might be hiring people who are a little bit more jack of all trades rather than kind of one skill set or one narrow focus. And so I think with product, if you hire the right types of people, they're especially for like really early stage companies, and maybe it's sub 50 employee companies, they're going to be nimble enough to kind of pick up the slack and the problems and like drive the product forward, but also kind of carry the company forward. And I think one of the benefits to having kind of like a centralized product team is, I think product can be glorified, but at the end of the day, you are serving a lot of other teams around you. And so what I think it can help do is actually, even if you're not setting the vision as an early PM and maybe your CEO is setting the vision, what it can help do is just align the rest of the company around that vision and around the steps that need to be taken across kind of all teams to be able to execute on that vision. So ideally, the role of product is, hey, you're actually removing friction and again, aligning people around this vision so that you guys can move faster as a company. In reality, what that means is like, again, you're often kind of picking up slack in different ways, kind of herding people in on the vision, making sure things get shipped on time, making sure that you're getting feedback from customers, but you're kind of keeping the wheels turning to move faster.
Got it. I see. And like, just to follow up on that, like, so Zenefits was able to like grow like a lot within like 2 years. So what do you think were some of the reasons like why like you guys were able to expand so quickly? Like if there were any like features of the company or like any really important decisions?
Yeah. So I think like one of the biggest things is that we were just selling a free product. So typically like the product we were replacing was typically an HR system, and that HR system, you had to pay a monthly fee. So we were free at the time. That HR system was also very siloed. So we thought of ourselves as almost like a hub and spoke model pertaining to the employee record. So instead of having a separate payroll system from your benefits system, from your HSA, your FSA, your time and attendance system, we were kind of bundling it all into one. And we were automating a lot of the work that if you were an early founder, an early, like a small business owner, you don't want to be doing that. You want to focus on your business. So it was definitely like the combination of a free product, a 10x better product experience. And then we were just like, we were aggressive. And part of that was getting the funding and the capital, but it was definitely a like go big or go home mentality. And just for scale, like the first year I was there, we scaled from a little under $1 million in revenue to almost 10 million in revenue. And usually like what I'm looking for as an investor in terms of kind of compelling benchmarks at that stage is like 1 million to 3 million. So like a 3x year over year. And we were a 10x year over year. So that was just, again, it was like, we were getting a flood of inbound, but we were also really scaling up the company and the sales team to be able to execute on the opportunity.
Got it. I see. Thank you so much.
That's a lot of good questions from our viewers. One thing that I think would be good to talk about is as early stage founders are sort of developing their infrastructure for their startups, what things should they be considering in order for future scalability?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I always think it's a lot of trade-offs in the beginning. And I think one of the things I think about is at a high level, what type of product are you building? So for example, if you're building a fintech product and you're touching people's money, you almost have zero room for error in terms of scalability and any sort of infrastructure or performance issues. But if you are building, say, a consumer product, maybe you have a little bit more leeway in terms of that kind of failure mode. And so one of the things that I think about a lot with some of the teams I work with is just that balance between how quickly you're building and moving versus almost the perfection or the quality element. And for me, it's always thinking about how are you oscillating between the two. You never want to get too far to kind of moving too quickly, breaking things, but you also probably don't want to be in the position where every line of code is perfect. There's no tech debt, because that to me, that signals that you might not be moving fast enough at the early stages. But again, I think about it comes back to the type of product you're building and whether you can afford to kind of have almost like a margin of error at times.
Yeah, so I guess if no one else has questions, if anyone else has questions, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask. But another thing that I'd be interested in, it seems that you've worked at a lot of companies in different stages of their growth. So with that breadth of experience, what have you learned, and like what are the differences between the challenges you see in each?
Yeah, so I would say one thing I think about is just the level of ambiguity. So if you guys are thinking about starting a company, have started a company, or just thinking about joining a super early stage startup, there are a lot of unknowns, obviously, and it's up to you to kind of wake up every day and want to figure them out and want to kind of chart your territory and chart your path. So one of the things I think about is just how comfortable are you with ambiguity? How much do you want to kind of be problem solving every day and figure out the problem with whatever means it takes. I bring up the example, like when I'm talking to people, I bring up the example of just like cold calls and cold emails a lot, because in the early days of startups, you're probably doing a lot of cold calls and a lot of cold emails, whether it's to customers or investors or outreach to candidates. So I also think in that regard, just it's like, how can you fail faster or like get rejection faster? Because that means that you're reaching for something that's outside of your scope. So I think a lot about ambiguity, problem solving, and just kind of how do you get shit done, really? And that might be kind of hustling outside of your kind of comfort zone sometimes.
Yeah, all good advice. I'll take a second to see if other people have questions.
Hey, Natalie.
Yeah,
thanks. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Whoever I just spoke over.
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna add on to Walden's question. Yeah, I guess I often hear about like almost like two options. It's either join like a mature company or sort of start your own company. But I guess the majority of people actually would like join a growing company potentially. And I know like one HBS professor, Jeff Busgang, has like written entire books on like joining growing companies as opposed to being like employee 1 or employee 1,000. So I guess like it seems like you were like employee 40 and then decided to transition over to investing as well. I'm curious if maybe any of those experiences have prepared you particularly well for early stage investing, or like what that transition was like from like building an early product to more so playing like an advisory role.
Yeah, so I think the question that you're bringing up, just in terms of like what's the trade-offs between joining early versus joining later, like that's something that I'm constantly talking to people about, and I thought a lot about in terms of my own career journey. I think it really comes down to how you think about risk and reward. And I think reward can mean a few different things in the concept of startups. I'd say personally for myself, I have historically been more risk seeking. And I think that's partly a factor of honestly my upbringing. So kind of like born in the Valley, my dad like moved out to the Valley in the 70s for grad school and to do software engineering. And he joined a company called Adobe when they were a startup, and he still works there today. So to kind of like see that journey and kind of his journey in terms of taking that risk early on, he instilled that in myself and my brothers and sisters. But I will say, like, Zenefits was a once in a lifetime experience in terms of seeing that growth. And I don't think I could have predicted that growth was going to happen. But it also, in a sense, like I sought the risk and you get a certain type of reward for that. And in the case of Zenefits, I actually think going through that experience, the group of people that I work with, just in terms of being an early employee and then meeting thousands of people within the company and kind of working in the trenches with them, that's been like a huge gift from the company. And then also just the brand name in terms of being able to talk about the story and kind of share the experience as like a unique data point has been really compelling. And I will say Zenefits like definitely one of the highest growth learning points of my career. That being said, I think trying to start something on my own and then also joining a 15-person company, it was similarly just different learning curves. And I think for me as an investor, I'd like to think it gives me more empathy in terms of the early journey and how, like, you could argue that when I joined Zenefits, not a lot, but like the early product market fit was there. Whereas with other companies I was working at, like I was going through the messy middle of figuring it out and talking to customers and trying to figure out like what was resonating with people in terms of product positioning, like the go-to-market strategy. So that was a different type of learning. And now I'm investing in companies that are typically like maybe a handful of people, an early product. And so you're going through that journey with them. And so I think it does help to, at least for me, it's helped to have that experience in terms of operating to then bring that to investing. But I don't know if I'm a good investor yet, and I probably won't know for another like 5 to 10 years. So we'll see.
Yeah, that's the thing. Yeah, you'll only know after like 10 years. So Yeah, but that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. Adam, did you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. It's going back a little bit, but originally like about your comments on marketing. So we're like planning a launch pretty soon, and you know, we know we're providing a product that's like better quality and frankly like more ethical than some of our counterparts, and this is in developing countries and it's for financial inclusion. So I'd kind of be interested in some thoughts that you might have with respect to like creating buzz is kind of the name of the game, something simple, interesting, intriguing, while still sort of like in a stealth mode. And like the tools that we have at hand are like 95% mobile phone connectivity, and Facebook is the internet outside of urban areas. So like, and it's kind of cowboy country in terms of what you can and can't do. So like, you know, if there's no rule sort of approach, you know, in that kind of environment, just any like tips, tricks, or just general lessons learned on how to approach something like that in a meaningful way.
You're selling direct to a consumer. You're not selling to a business. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, so it's B2B and B2C. So really what we need is the customer onboarding. So we're creating like this digital marketplace from which we draw data to inform lending decisions for financial institutions that can't reach those target segments. So it's a bit of both. Like we draw revenue from those lending institutions as well as from like merchants and through like subscription services and stuff down the road. But user onboarding is absolutely key. So that's who we're targeting for this. We're like bringing on partners in terms of like the B2B aspect, like as we go along, because we can like stack existing user bases. But we still need to like really create that sort of that buzz. And it's either going to be through like Facebook or word of mouth or generally speaking.
High level, and then I'll try and go into some kind of nitty gritty tactics. One of the things I just think about at a high level is two things. It's thinking about the awareness level of the user and how much you need to prime them in terms of either messaging or kind of positioning and like seeding the value prop. And then the other thing I think about is just how competitive the market is. And going back to that awareness, is it almost an offering that people are primed on? There's a category that's been created. The consumer knows what they're kind of opting into, or how much do you need to educate them within that category? I think in terms of, I always think about, especially pre-launch for a company, if your launch is on the horizon, how can you start drumming up as much demand as possible? So whether that's getting, maybe the metric is early waitlist signups, or whether it's just brand recognition and starting to go on that journey of kind of trust and credibility. And then in terms of nitty gritty tactics, I think a lot about how can you find evangelists within the existing communities, and how can you better understand existing communities to kind of supercharge them. And that might even be building up products or kind of like marketing campaigns or hacks. Like I've seen companies build kind of adjacent products that just serve a different need of the same user. And maybe they have a viral element to them. Maybe it's just a lightweight app or like a formulator that kind of provides a value to them, but then can kind of drive your brand forward. And then also just making it easy for users to talk about you and really share their love if it's something that is solving a pain point for them.
Yeah, that's super helpful. Actually, one of the recommendations we're given through we have a community association, like entrepreneurship association partner, and like the best way to kind of get on the nitty gritty piece, like if you're going to generate that buzz, it's got to be something that they can kind of use at the end of the day after work when they really be using your product, over drinks, that it's fun on their phone to like generate interest. And then it's like, hey, we can also add this value to your business, and and then kind of piecemeal it in. So it kind of lines up with one of the recommendations, but actually that adds a little more clarity to what they mean.
Cool.
So regarding the waitlist strategy, are there any ways to sort of drive up the value, or actually, let me rephrase that. So the waitlist is kind of a proxy for like validation of your company, or at least your the the worry with a waitlist though is if you have a bunch of emails of people, subscribing or joining, what can you do to sort of show investors that they're more enthusiastic than just putting in an email? Is there any way to sort of add more validation than just a long list of names?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I love thinking about this topic. So a few things I think about with waitlists is, yes, it's an early signal of kind of pent up demand, but there's also a half-life to how long you keep people on the wait list and how engaged they actually might be in terms of will they become users and like highly engaged users down the line. So I think about a few things with respect to wait lists. One of the first things I think about is just how can you gamify the experience and how can you think about unlocking different, like think about your wait list like a product and think about unlocking different challenges for users in terms of how they might show kind of how committed they are to your cause or the value prop of your product based off of the different challenges they unlock. So thinking about like the first step is you're signing up on the wait list. Maybe the second step is, hey, if you actually want to get moved up on the wait list, like tell us your exact reason and pain point for why you want to use our product. Hey, if you want to get moved up a second time, like share with 5 of your friends and help us get more users into the product. So kind of giving them these little hurdles and challenges. Another thing I think about is how do you actually keep the waitlist engaged and warm? So maybe you have drip campaigns and more of a content strategy. Maybe you're also letting people off the waitlist into an early alpha or beta based off of their level of excitement and kind of the challenges they've unlocked. And then I'd say the third thing I think about with waitlists is, and this is top of mind because one of the companies I just invested in, basically their domain is the spreadsheet, or sorry, it's called spreadsheet.com. Their domain is essentially what the product is. And so I like to think that there's a very high level of intent and awareness of what the product will help them do. And so before we invested, they had thousands of people signed up on the wait list. Going back to that concept of a half-life, we were basically like, this is demand that people have, and they have a hack in terms of the SEO strategy and like the domains that they've acquired in terms of being able to generate more organic demand kind of later in the company life cycle. So we saw, okay, people know what they're signing up for. There's a high level of awareness. That half-life we think is going to be almost like shorter or longer. Yeah. Michael
put in the chat, we utilize account creation and deal submissions as 2 indicators of demand. I think that's a really cool idea. Would you mind sharing more on that?
Yeah, so we basically are a brokerage for its real estate investors to source. It's like it's lending capital for their projects. So it's because it's the actual like a life cycle of an investment project can be anywhere from months to years. There's always going to be a lagging indicator between when they sign up to use our services as like account creation, when they actually have a deal. So we're able to generate, I think, a half a dozen different KPIs just on those 2 like individual data points to like track demand and like actual a customer retention. And then as far as like just finding new customers, we haven't done a dime of like a paid advertising, and I think at the end of the month we're already going to have about 18 million in a deal submission on the platform.
That's awesome.
So, yeah, it's just like it's all Facebook really. It's just me like posting on Facebook. So.
But it works. You're like hacking the system, right? And you're like
just
yeah.
Just a little bit. So.
Yeah, that's cool.
Awesome.
Yeah, so we're going to the end of our time here, but one last question. So everyone is like super hopeful about like what's going to happen, but like what if something goes wrong? What if your company is not scaling up as fast as you anticipated? What would you recommend doing? So in terms of like switching to maybe a new model, or are there certain tactics you can employ to really accelerate the growth?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that Definitely depends on where you're at in the company life cycle, but say you have an early product and again are kind of trying to find that initial spurt of growth, or maybe you had a spurt of growth and then plateaued. I think one of the things is really trying to be honest with yourself, and also honest with yourself in terms of the customer feedback and the pain point that you're solving, in terms of whether there is an opportunity in terms of what you're pursuing. And I think part of that is talking with customers. Part of that is kind of reevaluating the market in terms of competition, but really being, I guess, self-aware and reviewing kind of the performance and what that looks like. I will say startups are lots of like twists and turns. And so a lot of the teams we work with, they might not strike gold on kind of the first hit. I think for us, like, I mean, Postmates was a company we invested in early on. They completely pivoted into what Postmates is today in terms of on-demand food delivery. Discord as well completely pivoted based off of a unique insight that they had from the initial kind of gaming app. So I think it's loving the journey as well. So it's taking a hard look at kind of the business today, and also being open to kind of starting from square one again and really pushing forward on the journey. Yeah.
All right, so we are sort of at that 3 o'clock mark now. So, Natalie, thank you so much for coming and having this discussion with all our founders. It looks like everyone was sort of able to like ask questions that they wanted to know about. And it seems like the advice you gave would be very practical and use for these people in their startups.
Yeah.
And, of course, thank you to all of our founders for showing up and being proactive and asking our mentors the sort of things that you're looking for in this company. And that's great for growing your company into the future. So I guess that pretty much concludes this first IF meeting. So once again, thank you, Natalie, so much.
Yeah. And thank you guys for having me. And like my email, first of all, I love the format and like love kind of the discussion. And my email is just Natalie@Spark Capital. So feel free to reach out if you guys are working on stuff and want to chat or kind of jam on ideas, that type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe, Natalie, you're also joining our like sort of founders network and our sourcing network as well. Yeah. So she's always going to be connected with our HECP network here. Yeah. So I don't want to hold you guys any longer than you blocked out your time for. So I'm going to stop the recording here.